concept of the seven deadly sins is one of the most widely accepted religious beliefs in the culture as a whole. You may find it in the movie Seven, in the seven homunculi of Fumit Orms, in Dante's Seven Steps of Purgatory, and even in the seven princes of hell of medieval demonology. However, what very few people are aware of is that these seven crimes that are so well known were not always seven and were not always sins. In point of fact, this list has a very extensive history that dates back to a time before Christianity started. It is only after thousands of years that it eventually takes on the theological shape that we are familiar with today in this film. It goes through the philosophers of Greece and Rome, as well as the sages of the Jewish people. Therefore, we are going to take a brief look at the procedure that took place, right? How this list of sins came to be. But before we get into that, it is important to recall what the seven sins that are now on the list are, right? And we are able to accomplish this by utilizing this artwork by Hieronymus Bosch that is displayed on the screen. Approximately named The Seven Deadly Sins and the Four Last Things. This picture dates back to the year 1500 and depicts a composition of four elements. Is it true that these four last things constitute death? You are aware that the individual's death and resurrection are necessary for the final judgment as well as the journey to heaven and hell, right? They are located in the corners of the artwork, but the thing that piques our curiosity the most is this disc that is more in the middle. It comprises exactly seven deadly sins, and they are arranged in a clockwise direction: gluttony, lust, desire, pride, rage, envy, and greed, which is generally referred to as the Asi. It is possible that it may come out as a little odd, right? It's possible that at the time you thought of ASDD, you were thinking about laziness, but we'll get to that in a bit. And perhaps you're also more accustomed to the translation pride rather than pride and greed rather than greed. Nonetheless, I'm going to use pride and greed here in order to be more in line with the Latin phrases that we find in the sources that we will evaluate in a moment. In order to finish the painting, what do you think? The fact that Christ comes right in the middle of it, accompanied by the remark "Be careful, the Lord is watching you," right? Is another thing that should be taken into consideration. This brings the notion of the picture to a conclusion, which is that there is constant monitoring, mostly over these faults, and that adhering to them might lead to the worst of the final things, isn't it? As an illustration, there is hell in the corner of the room. Okay, bottom left. But rather nice, isn't it? According to Hieronymus Bosch, these are the seven sins that are considered to be fatal: greed, gluttony, thirst, desire, pride, rage, and jealousy in addition to greed. Of course, Bosch was not the first person to establish this list for the first time. If we travel back in time around 100 years and travel from the Netherlands, where Bosch was born, to England, we will discover a text that is not known to us called the Lantern of Light. This work is also quite intriguing because it discusses a primary group of seven demons that are in charge of their respective crimes. This categorization encompasses the following. There is no one prouder than Lucifer. It is the master of envy that Beelzebub is. It is Satan who is the master of rage. The ruler of sloth is known as Abaddon. The master of greed is known as Mammon. There is no one more gluttonous than Belphegor. The ruler of desire is known as Asmodeus. It is possible that in the future, other authors will alter this list of the correlation between sins and demons as well. Petros Binsphelius, for instance, will provide a list that is somewhat different from the one that we have here, but the seven most significant sins will remain the same in any of these lists, as they are the ones that we are still aware of. In the form of the seven deadly sins, and if we were to travel even farther back in time and travel to Italy at this time, we would also discover a very well-known illustration of this topic that appears in the Divine Comedy, which was written by Dante Alighieri. The Divine Comedy tells the story of a voyage through the several realms of the afterlife, including heaven, purgatory, and hell. Each of these places is filled with a number of really intriguing subdivisions. Isn't that right? Hell, for example, is formed of 9 rings, and each one of them, except for the first one, which is sort of a special case, right, which is limbo, is as if it were a torture station specialized for the punishment of a specific sin. For instance, the second circle is where those who are lustful are located, the third circle is where those who are greedy are located, and the fourth circle is where those who are greedy are located. Nevertheless, it is not true that all of the deadly sins that we are aware of are present in Dante's hell. We have to go to the other one, which is not hell but purgatory, if we want to locate exactly the list of the seven deadly sins as we know it now in Dante's work, right? The Divine Comedy is where we will find it. Purgatory in the Divine Comedy is a mountain that rises to the sky, and this mountain has 7 steps where the main sins are purged in each of these steps, and with each step overcome the climb becomes lighter and easier, and in this scheme the lowest step is that of pride, then comes that of envy, then that of anger, then that of sloth, then that of greed, then that of gluttony, and finally that of lust. So again, there are exactly these 7 sins right there. List is still quite stable, but if we go back a little further in time we will see that some instabilities, some turbulences will start to appear in this story. What happens is the following indeed. It was in the 11th century that Thomas Aquinas penned the Summa Theologica, which is widely considered to be one of the most influential books in the history of Christianity. A pope from the 6th century named Pope Gregory I had already spoken about capital vices, but Thomas Aquinas is the one who speaks specifically about capital sins. Yes, this is a massive work that discusses an infinite number of topics, and just in the index, it has more than 100 pages. Of course, it discusses a great deal about sins, including the possibility that it is because of this work that the expression capital sins became so popular. Where did he get the idea to call them capital sins? The philosopher Thomas Aquinas believed that certain crimes were similar to the heads of other sins. Additionally, the opening of the PR is the root cause of other sins. The word cape comes from the Latin word head, which refers to the other crimes. So, the sins of the grave. But what exactly are the sins that Thomas Aquinas considers to be the most serious? In addition, he claims that there are 7, but in reality, there are 8 of them involved. Vainglory, jealousy, rage, greed, gluttony, and lust are the 7 behaviors that we will discuss in more detail later. Clearly, pride is not on the list of things to do. Vanity is not the same thing as pride. That much is certain. Thomas Aquinas highlights the differences between these 2 concepts. According to him, vainglory is synonymous with vanity, which is the desire to achieve glory for the wrong reasons, with the wrong things, and in front of the wrong people. Being proud, on the other hand, is another thing entirely. Not acknowledging one's own state is the essence of pride. It is the individual who should be proud of themselves. It is important to note that all of the reflection on the special sins and capital sins in their theology begins from what had already been said by other ancient thinkers. As a result, Thomas Aquinas considers pride to be the worst of all sins due to the fact that it leads to insubordination, and more specifically, insubordination to God. As a result of this, he thinks of pride not as a capital sin, but rather as the head of the capital sins. He considers pride to be the queen and mother of all sins, as he himself says. Therefore, pride is considered to be the queen and mother of all sins. According to him, there are actually 8 main sins, but pride is above the other 7. Therefore, the list is 7 plus 1. Now, it is also important to note that all of the reflection on the special sins and capital sins in their theology begins from what had already been said by other ancient thinkers. In this conversation, the most important authority that he adheres to is Pope Gregory I, whom I stated before in the 6th century. Pope Gregory I, in turn, had been highly influenced by a monk named John Cassian who lived in the 4th or 5th century, who had been inspired by a Byzantine monk named Evagrius of Pontus. Is that correct? During the 4th century, the Pontic Evagrius was a significant figure. Are you sure about this one? It was Evagrius of Pontus. One may claim that he is the true progenitor of the list of the 7 sins that are considered to be fatal. But there is one thing to consider, right? His list did not even contain any sins, and it did not even have a 7. Is that correct? Allow me to elaborate on it, alright? Let's go on to Evagrius' list this time. He was the head of a community of monks in Egypt, and he authored a brief book with the purpose of identifying and opposing what he termed the 8 evil ideas. It is from these 8 bad thoughts that the 7 deadly sins originate. Evagrius of the Point was a monk who lived in Egypt. According to what he writes in this work, there are 8 broad and fundamental categories that encompass all ideas that are considered to be wicked. To begin, there is gluttony, followed by desire, greed, grief, rage, asceticism, vainglory, and last, pride. It is not within our control to judge whether or not these ideas are upsetting to us, but it is up to us to decide whether or not they will remain within us and whether or not they will arouse our feelings here. This is why we put pride and vainglory on the same list. We do not include envy on the list, and we also include asceticism next to melancholy. As I mentioned before, he does not refer to these things as sins at any point in time. Rather, he refers to them as wicked thoughts or daemons, which is the Greek phrase that pride originates from. Our words are nice. Devils. At this point, it is important to finally clarify what the so-called arse is in the context of this tradition of the 7 deadly sins. Which is correct? Why is it that it is sometimes associated with feelings of melancholy and sloth? According to Evagrius, the temptation to divert one's attention away from one's spiritual responsibilities and the activities that are necessary in the context of monastic life is what we mean when we talk of ars. The monastery, if his views are to be believed, is that correct? As a leader of a monastic community, he observed that it was quite common for the monks in his community to fantasize about a simpler life when they felt that they were under too much pressure or were dissatisfied with the rigorous life of the monastery. As a result, they stopped performing the tasks that they actually had in front of them, right? Within the confines of the monastery, in their actual lives there. Would you agree that this is what Evagrius considers to be harassment? This neglect, this lack of drive in respect to spiritual activities, and the awful notion of grief that Evagrius included on his list are all characterized in a manner that is quite similar to one another. What Evagrius condemns under the guise of grief is the notion that he recognized to exist among the monks, which is that they frequently regret having engaged in a religious vocation, having begun living in a monastery, and as a result, having given up the joys that were accessible outside of the monastery. Consequently, there is a strong resemblance between thirst and melancholy, and it is related to a kind of discouragement in relation to the present life, as well as the flight of the mind to another illusory world, which results in the disregard of the existing life, as well as passivity, paralysis, and lethargy. This instability in the list of the 7 deadly sins throughout history is due to the fact that one of the sins takes the place of the other or adds to the other. This is because there is a very strong relationship between idleness and melancholy. And lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning of the movie, the fact is that the history of this list of 7 deadly sins has roots that predate Evagrius, doesn't it? Even the religion of Christianity itself. It is important to keep in mind that I mentioned that Pope Gregory referred to the deadly sins as capital vices. When we consider the 7 deadly sins to be vices, this represents the key to understanding the link between the list of 7 sins and the civilization of the Greco-Roman world. Moreover, we have come to the realization that the contemplation that lies behind this list is not all that unlike to what ancient philosophers had previously done in their quest for the so-called art of good living, which was the ultimate objective of philosophy prior to this time. In this regard, Aristotle, for example, also prepared a list of vices and virtues that should be learned so that they may be avoided and censured, in the case of vices, and nurtured and commended, in the case of virtues. This list was intended to convey the importance of knowing both vices and virtues. For instance, in his work on rhetoric, he provides a list of 6 virtues and the vices that correlate to them. In the beginning, there is the virtue of justice, which is opposed to injustice. Then there is bravery, which is opposed to fear, moderation, which is opposed to intemperance, liberality, which is opposed to greed, splendor, which is opposed to meanness, and last, prudence, which is opposed to imprudence. The presence of this list in a book by Aristotle on rhetoric, specifically in the context of the art of persuasion, is not a coincidence. There is a connection between this and the fact that the society placed a high value on the distinction between vices and virtues. Greco-Roman is not just for the sake of ethics teaching but also for the purpose of the art of rhetoric itself, right? Because in a speech that is favorable to someone, it would be extremely advantageous to exalt the qualities of the person you are praising, and in a speech that is unfavorable, it will be highly valuable to bring out the vices of the person you are opposing. Since this was the case, it was of utmost need to be aware of the primary vices and virtues. Also, with regard to this connection between the list of vices and the art of rhetoric, it is noteworthy to remember that Cicero and Horace, 2 Roman masters of rhetoric, were also responsible for the production of lists of vices even before the birth of Christ. Isn't that right? These lists of theirs, as well as any future lists of deadly sins, share a great deal of similarities with one another. One example of a list compiled by Horace contains the following vices: gluttony, envy, rage, sloth, and desire. Other vices include dependency on drink and excessive ambition, all of which have a certain association with gluttony and pride, respectively. We also find some lists of vices that certainly had some influence on the history of the 7 deadly sins, the most interesting of these lists being the ones that we find among Greek and Roman authors. Not only do we find lists of this type among Greek and Roman authors, but we also find them in ancient Judaism, which is another very important cultural matrix for the development of Christian traditions. My belief is that it is at least mentioned in a literature that dates back to the 2nd century before Christ and is called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. This text, at a particular point, discusses 7 vices or 7 spirits of deceit, which include adultery, gluttony, strife, and lust, vainglory, vanity, being dishonest, and injustice. As we have seen, gluttony, vainglory, and pride will appear exactly with these names even in the lists of deadly sins. Fornication and conflict can also be translated in a way that is comparable to lust and anger. Therefore, among the 7 spirits of deception, we already find at least 5 of the deadly sins. There is a particular detail that is right in Greek. The word for injustice is very similar to the word for aseidia. Aseidia is akidia right, and injustice is considered to be adikia. Consequently, the only 2 positions that are reversed are the position of K in respect to D or the position of K right in reference to delta. This makes it conceivable. Ars ended up on the list, and injustice ended up leaving. But again, this is just speculation. But I think it's something interesting to be considered good. But that's it, right? Well, it's not confirmed. But it's possible that these words could have been confused at some point in the history of reading and copying manuscripts on the subject of vices. This is something that could have happened at some point in time. The tale, the brief history of the 7 deadly sins of Greco-Roman moral philosophy and the Jewish wisdom tradition, the spiritual discipline of the Christian mountains, as well as examples of medieval art and modern art, are all presented here for your perusal. One would assume that this is a summary of the summary of the summary. Wouldn't you agree? Exactly, that is it. Do not forget to share your thoughts and opinions in the comments section as well. Once again, I want to express my gratitude for watching, and I will see you again soon.